A quick thank you to all of my patrons. Your support is heavily appreciated. Every day, I wonder, is there hope? Reason to go on? So many false lies, so many broken dreams, so many times we are let down again and again. Why do we continue? Why do we bother? Why are we still here? Just to suffer? Testo pray! Hello everyone and welcome to my first visual novel review. Yes, Manpig has once again decided to expand his content in ways to cope with both his massive content burnout while pumping out the next huge Type Moon character showcase, which is taking way too much effort for a single episode. So in the meantime, I decided to do this as a way of sharing not only Type Moon content in a spoiler-free manner, but also maybe some other titles in the future. Either way, without a proper plan and idea, let's start the first visual novel review by treading on some familiar territory. And by that, of course, I mean Tsukihime. Think of the past, an older time. Specifically the really late 90s. Life was a lot simpler back then, and also a bit less advanced for sure. It was in such an environment where this story was created. An idea. An entry into the world created by the mind of a single college student who called himself Kinoko Nasu. The student had started a doujin group of sorts, and with a handful of people, he basically ran a club that would create and sell their own content. Their light novels didn't sell much, and they didn't really do anything major, until they made their first visual novel. That visual novel was named Tsukihime. Tsukihime is the first visual novel published by the people we now know as Type Moon. A company you've probably heard of before due to their extremely successful Fate franchise that started with Fate/stay night. The thing about Tsukihime though is that compared to Fate/stay night and the huge behemoth as the Fate franchise nowadays, Tsukihime is considered comparatively obscure. Fate/stay night was definitely their biggest boom of popularity in the West, especially due to how the various anime adaptations sold further casual fans on the visual novels. However, only about half of the modern Type Moon fanbase has actually read Tsukihime, and there are many people out there who haven't even heard of it. The truth though is that while Fate was important for sure, Tsukihime was almost certainly the most important Type Moon work to date, without question. While in the West it's considered obscure, in Japan and for the visual novel industry as a whole, Tsukihime is an extremely well-recognized title that many old-school Japanese visual novel fans will likely have read already. Tsukihime was the sole pivotal stepping stone that allowed Type Moon to grow from just a mere doujin group into a fully fledged company with staff and funding. Without Tsukihime, Type Moon would likely not exist in the same form we know right now, as not only would the group have remained just a bunch of close college friends, but also because most future staff members of Type Moon initially recognized and came to work with the group only because of Tsukihime's massive success in Japan. So what exactly is Tsukihime's deal? Let's take a look. First off, I'd like to start this segment with a reminder on what the Nasuverse is. If you didn't know already, a large portion of Type Moon's works take place in the same universe which is known as the Nasuverse, with characters, rules, factions, and events that are shared between many Type Moon stories. Tsukihime is no different, and thus it further adds to the Nasuverse in various ways. If you're a fan of Fate or Kar no Kyokai, Tsukihime adds even more lore and explanations to the world, and is similarly all connected. So expect some correlations between the lore of all of those stories, and also many references to them as well. Most popular works set in the Nasuverse are usually modern fantasy, set in the modern world but with a hidden side to it that has fantastical elements. What separates the Nasuverse to your typical fantasy is that a lot of the interpretations and takes on typical fantastical tropes are usually very unique, even if the original concept isn't an original idea. For instance, magic in the Nasuverse is not the act of casting of spells. That is something else known as magecraft, as it is the craft of a mage. Magic is something further, a mysterious godly power that allows you to almost bend the rules of reality itself. The idea of magic is a common one, but in the Nasuverse, it is interpreted and executed in a much more unique manner. Nasu does this a lot with his universe, and thus the world building is both insanely detailed, and in my opinion, that is definitely one of the strong points of the Type Moon brand. Now, the actual main story of Tsukihime is all centered around a boy named Shiki Tono, a relatively average teenage boy who, after an accident, ended up with the ability to see death in the forms of lines that cover any object. When he traces them with a sharp object, he can kill almost anything. However, the normal human mind is not one that it should be able to see true death, as death is the ultimate end of all things. It is something beyond the realm of human comprehension. As a result of that, when Shiki uses his eyes, he begins to feel very sick, and merely having them makes him susceptible to anemic attacks. The entire story is told through his perspective, as a visual novel typically is. However, due to the supernatural things that happen to him during the story, you can expect some very unorthodox writing for scenes and various moments that end up becoming quite memorable. Disappear. This chair is an eyesore. This chair, 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 this chair. To summarize the premise of Tsukihime, it begins with Shiki's little sister Akiha calling Shiki back to his childhood household in order to live alongside her once again since she recently became the family head. He is then greeted by two twin maids that work in the mansion, Hisui and Koaku, who act as servants for him and his sister respectively. However, as Shiki pokes around the house, he finds things about his childhood home that are off. Things that aren't as he remembers, and he feels that there are many things that both his sister Akiha and the rest of his family are hiding. Whilst that is happening, however, Shiki also runs into a blonde girl named Arquade Brunstad, who after looking at her, proceeds to murder her in cold blood in a sudden fit of madness, traumatizing him and making him extremely scared of himself. Yep. That's how he met the true heroine of the route. The next day, he finds out she didn't really die because she's apparently a vampire. However, Arquade isn't a vampire that hunts humans, but rather one that hunts other vampires that do hunt humans. And as punishment for his actions, Shiki has to follow her to kill a certain vampire known as a dead apostle that has been terrorizing the city that he lives in. That is the basic premise of Tsukihime. However, like how Fate's Day Night developed far more from its original premise of the Holy Grail War, Tsukihime evolved its own plot far more than its own premise gives as well, in ways that I won't mention because massive spoilers. It's really hard to talk about this story in detail because Tsukihime is one of those stories where less is way more. Experience this story as blindly as you can. That's my first piece of advice. A thing to note right off the bat with Tsukihime is that like a lot of early Nasuverse works like Fate's Day Night and Kano Kyokai, it is dark. And I mean dark. Expect heavy topics and difficult things to stomach like rape, trauma, and basically anything around that kind of storytelling. And also, remind yourself, this is told from the first person's perspective, so yeah, it gets kind of insane at times. Nasu does not hold back when describing how certain characters feel during certain scenes. It's not gratuitously edgy or gory, but this is most definitely a mature story. So if you're especially weak to those kinds of things, stay far away perhaps. The narrative of Tsukihime covers extremely different parts of the overall world that the story is set in depending on your route choice, to the point where you can essentially call the two parts completely unrelated. There are 5 routes in Tsukihime, with the heroines being Arquade, Ciel, Akiha, Hisui, and Kohaku, with a highly recommended reading order being how I just listed them out. Tsukihime is divided into 2 segments that each explore different aspects, which are called the near side of the moon and the far side of the moon. Now first off, the near side of the moon covers the roots of Arquade and Ciel, and is the side that's more connected to the wider overall Nasuverse. The near side of the route specifically focuses on the vampires, although factions like the Magus Association and Church also get more of a focus compared to other Nasuverse stories. The plot mostly involves Shiki teaming up with either Arcuaid or Ciel and going against two Dead Apostle ancestors, while learning more about the mystical sides of the world, as well as setting up mysteries relating to his family for the next side. The next side is the far side of the moon, which covers the roots of Akiha, Hisui, and Kohaku. Rather than focus on the vampires, the far side of the route focuses more on Shiki's past and the various mysteries relating to the Tono family that were established in the first two routes, but never gone into proper detail. It focuses more on demonic races and psychics, something that if you've either watched or read Kar no Kyokai, you should be very familiar with. It's also worth mentioning that it's impossible to get to the far side routes until you complete at least one of the near side routes for that very reason. So in order to get any of the far side routes, you must complete Arcuaid or Ciel's route to get to them. The individual routes of Tsukihime are an interesting case. Most of them are good for the most part, however there are a few noteworthy things to talk about for some of them. One is, Ciel's route is a little controversial because half of it feels like a rehash of Arcuaid's route. In fact, it is. However, its second half is a highlight of the entire visual novel in my opinion, which makes up for it for me. Also, Kohaku's route was literally added in last minute due to tons of pre-release feedback asking for a route of her, and so they did. As such, the route is both shorter than others, and unfortunately feels underdeveloped in comparison to the other four. However, even with that, it has some standout moments that keep it from being truly bad. Finally, the last route I really want to talk about is Hisui's route, and that's because, well... Okay, where do I begin? It's very hard to talk about the Hisui route without going into massive spoilers, but I will say this. There are many Tsukihime fans who love different heroines in various orders, and there are often debates on who is best girl. However, almost everybody, if not everybody, agrees on one route being one of the best. That route is Hisui's route, and in my opinion, it's worth going through every previous route just for this one alone. Hisui's route was one of the most enjoyable stories I've ever read in my life, and one that I consider a level of masterpiece. That is how good Hisui's route is in my opinion. I don't dare say any more, so everyone can just go in and enjoy it themselves. Please, you owe this to yourselves. I should also mention that Tsukihime is an R18 eroge. So yes, there are H scenes, and no, they aren't very good. If you think Fate Stay Night is meme-worthy, well, imagine that, but with Tsukihime tier art, and as my friend Zero called them, pepperoni nipples. It's so bad. Unlike Fate Stay Night, where you at least have decent art, Tsukihime's art just... No. That being said, there are a few H scenes that are important to the plot somewhat, specifically those in Hisui's route and Kohaku's route. So if you can't take porn, well, good luck. Tsukihime's overall story is very strong. Now don't get me wrong, it has some middling bits here and there, specifically in the middle portions of each route, but if there's one strength Tsukihime has, is that it's never truly bad in its plot. There's not a single part of Tsukihime that I felt completely uninterested, or that I was wasting my time. Even at its worst, at the very least it was a little slow as it builds up the world and characters, and for that trade-off, the highs are exceptionally high. Specific parts will stand out and stick with you permanently long after you finish the story, and when it hits those highs you can't help but think, damn, I guess this is why Tsukihime is regarded as a classic visual novel. I'd give this category an 8 out of 10 overall. Now if you like your characters, you'll find a few to love in Tsukihime, as the cast is, in my opinion, very solid and extremely well-rounded. There's a variety of characters here, both heroine and not, most which you'll probably enjoy. Of course, each heroine stands out from each other with none being too similar. However, all have their own unique quirks, so you may find yourself being drawn to one more than the other. First off, as the titular character of Tsukihime, Arcueil Brunstad is the main heroine, and also the one that most common material considers to be the most important. She's a simple character, but also one I would consider to be extremely likable. Being a whimsical, cheerful girl on one end, while also being wise and having a sense of maturity on the other. She hits a solid balance between both cute and genuinely enjoyable to be with some basic, yet convincing character development for her path. Although unless it's her route, she doesn't really always get the chance to shine. Especially since in Ciel's route, she's painted in a much more negative light, although that's not necessarily her fault as a character. It's just the fact that you end up with Ciel. Speaking of Ciel, she is an enjoyable older senpai that you just can't help but appreciate, especially with how friendly and genuinely kind-hearted she can be. One thing I absolutely love about Ciel is that her story is slowly drip-fed throughout her entire route, and as you begin to learn both her story and past, you begin to care for her a lot more as you figure her out. Ciel's character is a fantastic complement to her own route in my opinion, and overall, I think she's a wonderful older senpai that I will always look fondly on. Wonderful girl. Akiha's character is one of subtlety. She's a mix of the rich girl, tsundere, and imoto tropes, but also having surprisingly convincing reasons for having all of those tropes. She's a case where you'll likely need to understand her perspective well in order to become a fan of her, while liking her personalities to begin with. Personally, she didn't really do it for me. I'm sorry. I felt that while she tried to balance her personalities, it felt a bit unnatural. Akiha in the story is a case of where I felt she had the potential to develop a lot as a character, but it wasn't realized, even after her endings and in the Tsukihime sequels. Sorry, Akiha fans. I don't dislike her, but I really wasn't sold on her as much as the rest of the heroines. Hisui and Kohaku are the twin maids of Tsukihime, and on first glance they seem relatively unassuming, almost like side characters. Hisui is the silent kudere type, while Kohaku is the energetic How do not underestimate them, as their stories are a highlight of Tsukihime. You will like them by the end, if not cherish them. In terms of Tsukihime, the fanbase of the maids are by far the largest. For other noteworthy characters, one is Satsuki Yumizuka, who is actually a cancelled heroine of Tsukihime, and it's very evidently so. Her character is literally woven into the plot, very well mind you, as she is quickly made both likable and relatable on Shiki's end as a person. But then she's just cut short at one point and just forgotten. Not saying Kohaku didn't deserve her route, but Satsuki, she could have used one too, guys, especially with that setup. Come on. Now, of course, we have to talk about our protagonist, Shiki Tono, who is, in my opinion, one of my favorite characters in the Nasuverse for one big reason. He's written to be very easy to understand. Shiki is, deep down, a comparatively normal boy. Now, I'm not saying Shiki isn't hiding some trauma. In fact, he has quite the backstory relating to the Tono family, and oh boy, the things that happened to his mind due to his mystic eyes and other things. Yikes. However, the reason I argue he is relatable is because Shiki is a boy that's thrust into a mysterious world full of dangers and mystical creatures, and he reacts the same way I would in a similar situation. He's not like Shiro or Ryogi in that they're used to supernatural cases and or can hold their own emotions in a certain way. When Shiki sees a corpse, he gets traumatized and scared. When he gets to know someone, he treats them accordingly to how he sees their personality and grows to care for them as the story goes on. In general, there are many times I find myself thinking, if I was in this exact same situation, I'd probably do the same thing to what Shiki just did. He, in general, feels very human. There are, of course, more characters to talk about, but if I cover most of them, that'd be spoilers. Specifically the villains. I can say though that the villains are a combination of both being well written and sort of unrealized potential, with a certain debatable villain in Hisui's route that really makes the route stand out far more than it would have should they have not been written how they were. Overall, I'd say the characters of Tsukihime are a definite strong point, not only complementing the story but also carrying it at times. The cast is not perfect. There are a lot of side characters that don't do anything, and some of the main characters have flaws even though I do like them overall. Despite that, every highlighted character has at least depth, and you're going to find at the very least a couple, if not a lot, that you'll end up liking in the end. So this category gets a solid 9 out of 10. Okay, I'ma be real. From an objective standpoint, the art has not aged well as a result of being your typical doujin tier visual novel made in the 90s. I'm not saying the art is terrible, but it definitely has a sense of unrefinement due to the time of its creation and nature. I mean, just look at those necks. Don't get me wrong. The art is expressive, and if nothing else, all characters look very memorable, and their expressions are easy to get the read of. However, visually, Tsukihime is definitely the weakest of all type of visual novels, outside of Tsukihime's visual novel sequels, which are pretty much of the same indie level quality. For those who want their visuals to be pretty, well, maybe look somewhere else. The backgrounds literally even have just monochrome photos of real world locations and nothing else. So like, man, Tsukihime really does show that it was made by just a couple of dudes. Even then, I can excuse it all personally, because again, this really was just made by like 4 people and only one of them was an artist. Takeuchi Takashi basically carried Tsukihime from a visual front. He did virtually everything. For a one-man army, this is not bad, especially for the 90s. There's also no voice acting at all in Tsukihime, but for the time this was completely to be expected. For sound is going to be the OST. And throughout the entire visual novel, Tsukihime has a grand whopping total of 10 whole tracks. But despite that, they're all very good. I'm serious, despite the small amount, every track in Tsukihime is both memorable and stands out. There are some people who might find that the soundtrack is repetitive, and I can't argue against that. But in my honest opinion, each track in Tsukihime serves good purpose, and all of them, when complemented with the story, lead to some very memorable scenes. Track 8, the main theme of Tsukihime, is a song I always think of when I think of Tsukihime. Not to mention, the emotional track 7, the unnerving track 4, and the H-scene music of track 5, which is way better than it has any right to be. I genuinely love them all. Now, Tsukihime has 3 versions of OST, the original, Tsukibako's version, and the Ever After version. The most commonly found one on the internet is the Tsukibako version of Tsukihime, which acts like sort of a step up of the original OST, but all of them have their charms and merits. Personally though, I would recommend going with Tsukibako's version, as personally that's my favorite set of OST. Finally, from a technical standpoint, it's your typical fare for a visual novel in the 90s. It's actually pretty solid in that the GUI is stylized, but definitely not something special. The window is very small for a PC, but you can do Ctrl F for full screen, however expect some serious pixels if you do so. For the time, this wasn't bad at all, but objectively, Tsukihime has evidently aged, and it shows especially now that most visual novels at least use proper art for backgrounds. Overall, while I'm personally not too bothered with the many cutbacks Tsukihime has, in comparison to other visual novels, subjective value doesn't matter much, assuming you are someone that really cares for technological aspects in their reading experience. So overall, I'll unfortunately have to give this category a 3 out of 10, because it just isn't that impressive. I might as well say it, although if you know me, this is probably not a surprise. But Tsukihime is my favorite story of all time, and likely always will be at this rate. Sure, there are many stories that have more uniqueness, may appeal to others more, but Tsukihime was a story that really resonated with me in both atmosphere and characters. And when I hit its high points, those were reading moments I've never found myself forgetting so far, and probably never will at this rate. That is how much I enjoyed Tsukihime. Tsukihime is not a story you'll come across often nowadays in the modern world. It's very strange, bizarre, unique, and was really intended for mature audiences, and that shows in many ways, from its writing to its characters, as well as its events and themes. This isn't a story that holds anything back when it decides to, and it leaves one hell of an impact. Tsukihime has never had nearly as much fame in the West as it did in Japan. In fact, I'm willing to bet a solid amount of all of you that are watching this video right now are not a Tsukihime fan. Heck, perhaps you may have not even read the Fate Stay Night visual novel, and you know what? Fair enough, I was like you guys just a few years ago too. But I chose to continue, because I loved Fate and was curious about other works in the Nasuverse, and when I did, I fell in love with what I saw. I want you to try and read Tsukihime. I believe that if you love Fate, if you love stories, heck, if you just want something other than your generic isekai power fantasies nowadays in seasonal anime, I truly believe you'll find something special here. Something you'll love. Overall, there are many reasons you may want to consider reading Tsukihime. It's connected to the expansive Nasuverse. It has an extremely well-written main cast of characters, all who are each three-dimensional and have multiple layers of depth and or development for every individual cast member. It is overall one hell of a unique, mature experience that has a form of writing that you will not see in most stories. However, skip this if you're queasy and don't enjoy dark subjects like abuse, rape, trauma, and anything along that line. You may also find pacing problems in certain routes, but personally I never had that much of an issue, so your mileage may vary. I can't speak from experience from that. It's also worth noting that Type Moon have announced and are working on a remake of Tsukihime that will update everything including art, story, world, etc. However, the announcement was made a decade ago. We haven't received many updates from it since then. This is the Half-Life 3 of visual novels. Like, they're apparently still working on it, just really slowly with almost no details revealed. So, yeah, just read the original right now. Overall, with all these things in mind, I'm going to give the original Tsukihime visual novel a recommendation of must-read. If you're curious about this story, you should absolutely dive in and see what it has to offer. However, also realize that it is not perfect and has flaws due to its age as well as various difficult choices in the narrative. However, if you're interested in reading Tsukihime, well, good luck finding it legally. Unfortunately, the Tsukihime visual novel has been out of print for more than a decade and a half. Yeah. Not to mention, there's never been an official English release, only an English patch for the Japanese game, so you may have to pirate. Like, gonna be real, that's how most people read Tsukihime nowadays, cause shit's really rare. I mean, holy crap. Honestly, at that point, just don't bother. I'm sorry if you really want to be legal and stuff, but damn. Remake release when? Either way, that concludes my review on Tsukihime. This was, of course, my first review, and is also a repurposed version of 4 previous videos, so it might not be indicative of all future reviews. Things might change in the future. However, if you enjoyed something about this review, please tell me. And also, please definitely tell me if you yourself have some thoughts on how to improve my reviewing style in the future. Regardless, I hope you all had fun, and maybe I'll see you somewhere else on the internet next time. Take care.